But anyway, today's talk is, I think, almost practically a year ago. Samantha did a talk on Samantha Bilton, Sam Bilton did a talk on gingerbread. And she mentioned at the time she was finishing up a book on saffron. And gosh, back in another lifetime, it feels like we did have a talk. The Cornish Society of Chicago did a talk with us on saffron, and we served saffron buns. And to tell you how long ago it was, I don't think it was yet the year 2000. So a long time ago. And unfortunately, the person who would have really been thrilled to be here today went to heaven maybe about 10 years ago. So anyway, Sam Bilton is a food historian who runs the Repast Supper Club. We talked about that the last time we saw her. But these are food events with a historical theme. She's also a food and drink writer with articles appearing in magazines and online with English heritage. And she works on historical recipes, recreating them for the modern day, including an 18th century recipe for a bride cake. And she's a member of the Guild of Food Writers. I'm sure there's other things I should have said, but you know, Sam, you can always fill us in. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Highlight you and get rid of myself. There you go.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I hope everyone can hear me. And if you can't, you better shout. I was saying to Kathy yesterday, I've got a new computer, and I'm using headphones, so I can hear myself. That's going to be an awful lot of use to you guys if you can't hear me. So fingers crossed you can hear me loud and clear. I'm going to give you a brief presentation on saffron, or specifically the history of saffron in England. If you have any questions, I think it's probably best I'll answer them at the end. But if you want to pop them in the chat, if something springs to mind when I'm going through the presentation. Just to say, I did a presentation earlier this week, actually, to the Leeds Food Symposium, which is a collective of food historians in the north of England. And I did say to them that this presentation, my slides are designed for what I call a lay audience. So there may be some that I skip through a bit more quickly because I suspect I would be teaching grandmother to suck eggs. But some things you have to explain sort of in sort of minute detail when you're doing it to people that aren't necessarily that familiar with certain historical trends and facts. So without further ado, I am going to try and share my screen. And begin my presentation. So what we can see here, I'm actually going to explain this now while it's on the screen, because normally I cover this a little bit later in the presentation after the picture's gone, which is absolutely pointless. I can see that now, but when I put it together, I picked this beautiful picture of this flower. This is the Crocus sativus. This is the saffron crocus. This is the only crocus that you will get saffron from. Now, it's not to say other crocuses don't exist, because obviously they do, and some do look quite similar. There's one in particular which flowers at the same time, which is the autumn, so in the fall. So this is right now in England. My current saffron growers that we have in this country are getting ready, getting prepared for the saffron harvest. And if you can just see these leaves here, they're sort of quite, they're a bit blurred obviously because this is a close-up picture. They're sort of quite long and thin and quite pointed. This is what's coming through the ground now. I've got a few saffron bulbs planted in pots in my garden. I'll explain why they're in pots shortly. And that's what I've got poking through. So it's a time of great excitement in terms of the saffron harvest, because it's a very short period, as I'll explain. So you have these beautiful petals, purple flowers that come into bloom in the autumn, and they have these three long pendulous stamens in the middle. And these are referred to as the threads or strands, and this is what is dried to make saffron. And as I said, there are other varieties of saffron that flower at this time of year. We have one in England called the Autumn Crocus, rather confusingly. It's also a purple or lilac colour, but unfortunately it's not good for making saffron from. It doesn't have, this is Crocus sativus, is one of the few aromatic or saffron cultivars that has a scent. So it's very specific. It's only this variety that you can get saffron from. The autumn crocus is also known in France as mort aux chiens, death to dogs, because if dogs consume it, it can make them very poorly. I'm not sure it has that same effect on humans, but I quite like that fact. So I like to share that. Anyway, just a little bit about me. This is maybe a lot lost on you guys, because unless you know sort of the jokes about Essex girls in England, it's not a compliment, unfortunately. But I'm born in Essex. I was born in this town that you can see on screen. I wasn't actually born in this building, I hasten to add. This is the Guildhall in a small town in Essex, England, called Thaxted, and this is where my parents still live. They moved back there a number of years ago. I currently live in Sussex, which is just south of London. Essex is slightly north of London. And the reason I got interested in saffron in the first place is because my parents went to school in a town called Saffron Walden. And as I was growing up, I began to wonder, why would a town in Essex become associated with the world's most expensive spice? Because it's not something you would associate as being grown in England. We have a very temperate, damp climate for the most part. This summer was an exception, obviously. I don't know whether you've heard on the news, but we had a very dry, hot summer, which is incredibly unusual for this country. Although East Anglia, of which Essex is a county that features in that eastern part of the country, is renowned for being slightly drier than, say, other parts of the country. But even so, it's generally, we get a lot of rain, and it's not generally that warm either compared to other parts of the world. So yeah, that's sort of what kick-started my interest in saffron. And it sort of, my journey began from there. So when I say, I mean, I sort of wondered where it had come from and started looking into it. And it really is quite a fascinating story, because as we'll see, we used to have a thriving saffron industry in this country. So one of the questions I get asked is, how did it get into England? And this is quite an interesting story. There's a number of theories. Some of them are a bit more romantic than others. Now, what we have here is a picture of a lady, and they also, if you expand the whole fresco, unfortunately, this is the only image I could get from the internet for free. There are also monkeys. You can't see the monkeys picking what we believe to be saffron, but this is from a fresco found on Akrotiri on the island of Santorini, which used to be known as Thera, which depicts saffron being picked by young women and monkeys, and it dates from around 3,500 to 1100 BCE. So we think this is where the saffron crocus originated and where it started to be cultivated way back thousands of years ago. But again, that doesn't explain exactly how it came here. So these are the three theories which I'm going to go through. These are the three main theories. I've drawn my own conclusions as a result of my research, which I will share with you shortly. First of all, we have the Phoenicians. Now, Kathy mentioned the Cornish society earlier, and this is a popular belief in Cornwall that the Phoenicians actually brought saffron to Cornwall. Now, they had a great influence across the Mediterranean. Phoenicia broadly corresponds to modern day Lebanon today. But as you can see, this red line on this map here, it sort of shows you exactly where their sort of influence stretched. And it's as I say, right across the Mediterranean, even as far across to Gadir, as it's written on here, or it's sometimes written as Gades, which corresponds to modern day Cadiz in Spain. Now, the story goes that there was a Phoenician called Himilco, and he was tasked with finding a new source of tin, because the Phoenicians were particularly renowned for their beautiful bronze work, which this item you can see on the screen is housed in the British Museum in London. And they need tin to create bronze, and so they were sourced with, they used to get quite a lot from Spain, but apparently the Spanish supplies were dwindling. So Himilco was tasked with finding a new source of tin. And he sailed up the coast of Spain and bypassed France, which was renowned to have tin as well, and ended up in Cornwall. And it was trading, he traded supposedly the saffron for the Cornish tin. Now, unfortunately, the Phoenicians had no form of coinage that we're aware of. So it was mostly their trade was done on a bartering system. And because saffron is, of course, an organic item, we have no archaeological evidence to support this, or indeed there have been very limited. I mean, I think a few beads have been found in Cornwall to date that they think might be Phoenician, but there's no sort of archaeological evidence to support a presence of Phoenicians in that part of Britain at this time. The next theory is the Romans. Now, I don't know, this is the theory that the Romans generally get blamed for everything, from building roads to England's love of spices. Some theories of which are well-founded, others perhaps less so. One of the reasons they think the Romans brought it here is that we have a town in England, it's actually part of Greater London now, called Croydon. And the theory is that the name Croydon comes from the Old English Crogaden or Croyden, which means valley where the wild crocus grows. And they believe, or people that believe this theory, think that the Romans planted the saffron crocus, Crocus sativus, in this valley, and hence that's how Croydon eventually got its name. But now we do know that Theophrastus and Pliny praised the saffron, particularly that was grown in Cilicia, which is in modern day Turkey. And primarily they use saffron in things like perfumes, which they used to spray around theatres. Saffron, as we know, is very aromatic, so you can see why that would be popular. It was also used in medicines, particularly eye salves. Pliny even thought that if you consume saffron before drinking wine, it would help stop you from getting drunk. I don't think I've ever seen any evidence to support that theory personally. And it was also used in their spice wine known as Hippocras. But it wasn't used a great deal in Roman cookery. In Apicius, for example, there's only a few examples where saffron specifically is listed. So it didn't have, I don't think it was prized so much as a culinary ingredient by the Romans, not when you can think about their usage of pepper or cumin, for example. Now, what we do know is that the Romans loved gardens, particularly around tombs. Virgil wrote a very fanciful poem called the Culex, which tells of a shepherd building a tomb for, I guess you'd call it a mosquito, that saved him from being attacked by a serpent because it bit him just before the serpent was going to bite him. And he, around this tomb, the shepherd plants roses, hyacinths and crocuses, which some translations interpret as being the saffron crocus. They also grew fruit and vegetables in their gardens in large villas. So there's one not far from where I live in Sussex called Fishbourne, and they've done extensive excavations, and I've identified an area that they believe was probably a kitchen garden. But of course, again, there's no pollen samples that have survived to say exactly what was grown there. So it's hard to say for sure if they were planting saffron and harvesting it at this time. And even if you find seeds like olive pips, for example, it doesn't mean that they were actually grown here. So Pliny has also said that he didn't think it was even profitable to plant saffron in Italy. So it seems more likely to me that they would have been importing saffron in its dried form from other areas of the empire, which is, of course, was vast, rather than going to the trouble of trying to grow saffron crocus, apart from perhaps as a quirk of something that was maybe of interest, but not on a commercial sort of level where they were harvesting it on a regular basis. And then finally, we come to probably the most famous theory, which is that a pilgrim smuggled one saffron corm. This is what you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. This is how a saffron crocus grows. It comes from these corms or bulbs. It's entirely sterile. So the only way it multiplies is being in the ground. These bulbs are said to child. So if you leave them in the ground for a long time, they multiply, and then you lift them up and you will have more saffron corms. So the theory goes, pilgrim travelled to popularly believe the Holy Land, but obviously you have to remember that there were other destinations like Santiago de Compostela in Spain or Rome itself. But he came across saffron and smuggled a bulb in his pilgrim staff. And that is how the entire saffron industry began in Britain. But as we will see, one saffron corm does not a saffron harvest make. Now, we do know that pilgrims, it's very likely they encountered saffron, whether in its dried form or even the bulbs. For example, if you were going to the Holy Land, a popular place to sort of set off from was Venice, because it had good links to that part of the world. And it was also the centre of the spice trade at this point. William Way, who was a travel writer writing in the 15th century, advises pilgrims to stock up on dried fruit and spices like saffron in Venice before they go to the Holy Land, because he says it shall give you great ease by the way, to prepare them for the feeble bread, wine, and stinking water they were likely to encounter on the voyage. The UNESCO World Heritage Site for San Gimignano claims that pilgrims were astounded by the fields of purple that they could see en route when they were travelling the Via Francigena when they were en route to Rome. Although it's been noted by Gillian Riley, who's quite a renowned food historian here in England, that it's not really clear exactly when saffron came to be grown in Italy. It was certainly grown at some point in Italy, but as to when that was happening is a little unclear. And then lastly, Santiago de Compostela in Spain could be another area where they encountered saffron. We know that, for example, saffron was being grown in Spain at some point between the sort of 8th and 10th century. It really sort of took off, particularly in La Mancha, where it's still grown extensively today, but also Aragon and Valencia. So, and gradually from Spain, it travelled northwards. So by the 14th century, it was definitely being grown in France around the Gâtinais, which I think is it's quite far north actually. So it's possible that, at the same time, it travelled into England. Whether or not that was with a pilgrim, I'm sort of on the fence there. I should just say my own view is that probably it came from Spain. My personal view, given everything I've read, there was certainly, if you were travelling to Santiago, it was quite easy to get there from ports in the southwest of the country in Cornwall, like Foy, for example. So it would stand to reason that certainly in Cornwall, I would think it's more likely to be sourced from Spain than perhaps Phoenicians. But anyway, however it got here, at some point we decided as a nation, or our farmers decided as a nation, that it was a good crop to grow. Now we have a vicar called William Harrison. He was the 16th century rector of a village called Wimbish and Radwinter, which are both very close to Saffron Walden. Saffron Walden is, I say, this small town in Essex where my family are from. And it was particularly renowned. It got associated with the growth of saffron by the sort of early 16th century. It used to be known as Chipping Walden, which was Chipping means market. But in the early 16th century, Henry VIII granted the town a charter, and they changed its name to Saffron Walden. Now, William Harrison had a great interest in history at the time, so he was writing after the Henry VIII's time. He was writing in Elizabeth I's reign. But he says that he places the date of it being widely grown. Now, I use that term widely because I think it probably was being grown in, say, monastery gardens for medicinal purposes, certainly prior to this. But on a wide scale, it was grown somewhere between Edward III, who started his reign in 1327, and Richard II, who's finished his reign in 1400. So we're basically looking at saffron being grown here on a wide scale from sort of the 14th century. Now, Dorothy Cromarty, who was a historian who was from Saffron Walden, she did a study of the Chipping Walden court rolls from 1381 to 1420 to see if she could find a link between saffron and the town. And she identified a lot of dye works in Saffron Walden, or Chipping Walden as it was then, because Essex was was renowned for its sheep wool production. So they had dye works to colour their wool various colours, and saffron was used as a dye. I'm afraid that's a bit out of my sphere of knowledge, so I don't really touch on that too much in the book, I'm afraid. But she couldn't find a specific reference to saffron, but she was convinced that it was a logical assumption to make that it was being used to dye wool at this time, because why else would you use it? I mean, it is, as we will see, was used by the wealthy quite a lot in the medieval era in food, but it was also used as a dye. So she thinks it's an entirely logical assumption to make that saffron was being used in the sort of 14th century into the 15th century. And certainly by the time she started to look at the later records for around the 1440s, it was an important enough commodity around the town of Chipping Walden to enter into land transactions and affect rents. But the thing that we think probably prompted it most of all was the Black Death. Now, this occurred between sort of around 1348, 1349, and had a huge impact on English society. A conservative estimate is around a third of the population in England succumbed to the Black Death, and it could be as much as half the population. There are records, for example, that say that whole villages were wiped out by this disease. Now, of course, fewer people meant that there was less labour to cultivate the land, but conversely, there was also less demand for food. So this sort of provided an opportunity, if you like, for more alternative crops to be cultivated that were perhaps more lucrative to the farmers, and could be done saffron particularly could be done on a small scale. And this has been dubbed alternative agriculture. Now, the beauty of saffron is that it can be cultivated on small plots of land. Now, this is a description that was found in a pocket book actually in Cambridgeshire rather than Essex, which is a neighbouring county, and it dates from 1771. The chap whose pocket books, or sort of accounts, if you like, were like his household accounts, was called Thomas Whale. And he, we don't know his relationship to William Clark. We don't know whether he was a friend or whether he was a tenant, but William Clark was cultivating saffron in Little Shelford, as I say, which is in Cambridgeshire. And he sort of provided details on exactly how saffron was produced and farmed. And it hasn't changed. It has to be said, there's not an awful lot of difference between how it was done in the 18th century, and I'm sure it was pretty much done the same in the centuries before that, and to how it is even done now in the 21st century. Now, we also know that there's a vast amount of, we know that saffron was an important crop because it crops up in wills. So a typical area of land where they would plant saffron or have a saffron ground, if you like, would be measure, I haven't actually written it down in meters, but it's called a rood, which is 1/4 of an acre. Now, in England, that's about, I think, something like 1/3 of a soccer pitch. I don't know how that would correspond to your football pitches in America, I'm afraid, but it's not a vast amount of land. And that you'd have these parcels of roods that were planted up with saffron. And we know this because a lot of wills make reference to a rood of saffron being left quite often to the wife rather than the son. So one example we had was this chap called William Hutchison of Sawston, which is again in Cambridgeshire, and he left a rood of saffron to his wife Johann in 1531. But he was quite a generous chap by all accounts, because he also left half an acre, which is 2 roods, to his son John, and 1 rood to his maid Marjorie. Now, I don't quite know what Marjorie did to benefit getting the same bequest as his wife, but she was clearly a valued servant, because she did indeed inherit half a rood, one entire rood rather, of saffron, which would have been incredibly valuable at the time in the 16th century. So this is a picture. This is actually the end of the process. I'll just explain briefly how they sort of prepared the land. So initially you'd have this tract of land. Now they could be sort of on the margins of other land that was being cultivated. Quite often they're sort of, even today, they're sort of in quite odd locations, because it was, I'd say it was a form of like a sideline, I guess, for a lot of farmers, so they could make a bit of extra money. The land was prepared by hand in the spring or summer, so it would have to be ploughed. You'd have to remove the large stones, any weeds, and then it would be well, most farmers would then apply some kind of animal manure or dung to help fertilize the land. Quite importantly, it should be not that it shouldn't be stiff, what a lot of commentators refer to as stiff soil, which is clay. I live in Sussex now, and where I live, although I can see the beautiful South Downs from my house, my garden is clay, and you could frankly build bricks out of it, so it wouldn't be suitable for saffron cultivation, which is why my saffron bulbs are in pots. But generally, free draining soil that which was chalky or sandy was preferred, and you would add the additional dung to improve the fertility of the soil. There is one chap called Richard Bradley who entirely disagreed with this method, but generally speaking, that seems to be what most of them did. So they would they would prepare the soil in the spring around Lady Day, which is towards the end of March or early April. And then in the summer, they would plant the bulbs. Now, nowadays, they can use a bulb planter, which are quite popular in the Netherlands when they plant their tulips and things. But back then, it had to be done by hand. So as I understand, having read a number of treatises on this, the gentleman would go around digging a trench, and the ladies would follow behind, and they would have to plant the bulbs or the corms in themselves, and they would be 3 inches deep, roughly 3 inches apart. So you can get thousands in this small tract of land, absolutely thousands of saffron corms, which is hence one saffron corm does not a saffron harvest make, my comment earlier. Then, of course, the flowers would just sit there, and you had to protect your grounds. The biggest pests were for hares. Whenever you read these documents, they always moan about the hares. Sometimes cattle could be a risk if they got in and trampled the tender leaves, those little leaves I showed you at the beginning, because the plant needs that obviously to get the strength to produce the flowers. So they had to, I mean, it's not shown on this artist's impression, but they had to be fenced in, these roods, so that you could keep the hares out, and or the rabbits and cattle as well. And the flowers appear in the autumn, and they are, as you've seen, beautiful. These purple, although these all appear to have come up at the same time. And it's at this point, it really is a race against time. The saffron has flowers, even now, they have to be picked first thing in the morning, before, as the in old documents would say, they were fully blown. So before they're open, like that beautiful one I showed you at the beginning, ideally you pick them when they're still closed. And it has to be done quickly and efficiently. And that's why, but one of the reasons, again, women were used and small children, and they would go out, come rain or shine, 7 days a week. Even on a Sunday, they would be out in the fields picking the saffron. And then, of course, they had to go back to the house and process them, because at this point, you've just got a basket full of flowers. And this is one of the reasons saffron is so expensive, because it's such a labour-intensive crop to farm. So here we've got some saffron flowers that have been picked. This was actually in Kent, which is just along a little way from where I live in Sussex. And you would pick the flowers, and you can see the stamens in there, and then you would have to take them back and remove those stamens by hand. And it takes a long time. So I spoke to one saffron grower in England, modern one this is, and he reckons it takes him around an hour to pick 1,000 saffron flowers of the crocuses, which I think sounds quite quick personally. I don't think I'd be able to pick that many in an hour, but it takes 3 times as long to take the stamens out. And at this point, they are scented, but I was quite surprised. I always thought it would be quite an overpowering scent, like a hyacinth, but actually it's quite a delicate scent, and it is rather pleasant. But it's that characteristic smell that we associate with saffron doesn't develop until the spice has been dried and then left to mature. Now, nowadays, we use dehydrators. So you can see on this picture here, this is some fresh saffron stamens that have been laid out to be dried in a dehydrator. And you can see clear individual strands, which we refer to now as hay saffron. But in sort of the 16th and 17th century, this is not how they were processing saffron. What they would do is they would make cakes of saffron. So they would take these beautiful red stamens and they would gather them together and sandwich them between 2 sheets of paper. And then they would be put on it they would have to be dried in a kiln. Now, I'm just going to read you something. This is Richard Bradley, who I mentioned earlier, and he wrote extensively about the saffron industry in England, and from sort of in the early 18th century, so right sort of the teens, if you like, right up to his death. It was shortly after this. I think he died around 1730, 1731. But he describes a saffron kiln, and the picture you can see is again a modern artist's impression. So the kiln is much narrower at the bottom than the top. That is about a foot square at the bottom and 2 foot at the top, and about 2 foot high. This is made of oak, framed together and covered with laths on the outside as well as lined with them. Upon these laths within its side is spread a strong mortar 2 inches thick, and the outside is covered with lime and hair. But the bottom on the inside must be covered 4 or 5 inches thick with strong mortar to serve as a hearth to lay the fire on, leaving a hole on one side to put the charcoal in the charcoal fire and give it air. Now, charcoal was preferred because it was relatively smoke-free, but of course you had to have it at the right temperature. You couldn't, if it were too hot, you risked scorching the saffron, as Bradley observes here. And if it weren't hot enough, you wouldn't be able to dry your saffron effectively. So what they did was they had this sandwich, the saffron's put between these 2 sheets of paper, and then you had sort of woolen blankets, if you like, but on either side of that. And it was put on top of the saffron kiln. After an hour, the sandwich was flipped over and left for another hour. And it was generally deemed that if you could get through this first 2 hours without the saffron catching fire, sometimes they would sort of lightly sprinkle the saffron cake with with beer rather, to sort of help it sweat, if you like, to get out the moisture out of the saffron stamens. If you could get through this first 2 hours without it catching on the outside, then generally the high risk element of drying had been sort of averted. But that wasn't the end of it. It took a full 24 hours to dry completely. And during that time, the cake had to be flipped every half an hour, every 30 minutes. So again, quite a laborious process. Now, the papers themselves would, obviously the saffron would sweat, so it would leach out some colour and flavour, and they could be sold to make tincture. So it was one of the perks of the dryers. I know Sally Francis, who runs Norfolk Saffron, who kindly provided this picture to me, she thinks that the saffron dryers were separate from the saffron growers. I'm not so convinced, because I've certainly seen some records that imply that people that grew saffron had their own kilns. And also I think this would have been quite heavy, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Just to give you an idea of the yields, 5 pounds of those wet or sort of fresh stamens that we saw equates to 1 pound of dried saffron when it's actually dried, ready for use in recipes. And the yields would also affect the price of saffron. So in a good year, if there was lots and lots and lots of saffron produced and available on the market, it could fetch as little as 20 shillings a pound. But if it were a year where there weren't so much English saffron on the market, it could be as much as £3 or £4 a pound. So of course, although it was a lucrative industry, it wasn't, it was never certain. You were never quite sure what sort of year you were going to have in terms of yields. And it will be interesting to see how this hot, dry summer we've had in England has affected our own saffron crocus, saffron crop this year. So one of the reasons we grew saffron, well, it had many uses. As I mentioned, dyeing was definitely one of the uses for this crop. Medicine, which I will talk very briefly about, I do discuss briefly in the book, and food, which is obviously my primary area of interest, being a food historian. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I'm also conscious of time about the 4 humours, but it was basically the view was at this time, as you're probably all aware, was that what you ate could have an impact on your health, and it could help treat illnesses as well. So, and it depended on your complexion, or sort of whether you were a person that had more black bile or yellow bile or phlegm in terms of the 4 humours. Nicholas Culpeper, who was a herbalist writing in the 17th century, had, listed a variety of things that saffron was good for from a medical perspective. He describes it as a herb of the sun and is under the line, and therefore you need not demand a reason why it strengthened the heart so exceedingly. But he also warns that let not above 10 grains be given at any one time, for the sun, which is a fountain of light, may dazzle the eyes and make them blind. A cordial being taken in a moderate quantity hurts the heart instead of helping it. But it does have a variety of benefits, including treating consumption, diseases of the lungs, plague. You frequently see saffron listed in treatments for the plague. I believe they put it in pomanders as well, as a preventative for when people were walking around. Measles and yellow jaundice. And the interesting thing with measles was that even into the 20th century, it was believed that a saffron tea could help sort of cure or help alleviate the symptoms of measles when you caught it. Though, of course, one of the reasons it was important to be careful about what sort of herbs and spices you used in your food is that they could generally, and indeed medicines, is that you could treat symptoms or poor qualities in certain foodstuffs with these wonderful spices that had opposing qualities. So saffron was believed to be hot in the first degree, dry in the first degree and hot in the second degree. And fish, by contrast, was obviously very cold and wet. So it's, you've probably heard the story, for example, of Henry I, one of our Plantagenet kings, who died from eating a surfeit, or too many lampreys, in 1135. So he would definitely have benefited from this dish, which is from the form of curry, which is an almond milk sauce scented with saffron and spices, with currants and more almonds added. It was, fish was eaten a lot in the medieval era, this sort of cold, wet ingredient. And it, because of the number of days that we had where we had to fast, where we weren't allowed to eat meat, and periods where we weren't allowed to have dairy either, so particularly Lent and Advent, which are sort of occurring in the darkest time of the year. It should be said that all milk, whether it's dairy or almond milk, is a great vehicle for saffron. It really does take on the colour. So you can see why it would be popular. And also these occurred at the darkest times of the year. And Culpeper speaks of saffron sort of gladdening the heart. So I think personally that he's talking from a medical perspective, obviously, but I think, yellow food, golden hued food certainly sort of is quite joyous, and a joy is, makes you feel happy inside, or makes me feel happy inside, but I might be slightly biased there. But colour of food could sort of have a greater meaning, if you like, rather than just simply being, to make it look nice, and which undoubtedly it did. It could carry spiritual and moral connotations. Now, when we have things like yellow, when I say spiritual and moral connotations, it could be as simple as white's good, black's bad, good and evil, that sort of a thing. But it wasn't always as cut and dried as that. So in the 13th century, the colour yellow actually could denote falsehood, which is rather confusing when you've got something that's saffron coloured. But eating golden food was considered to be incredibly beneficial. Now, we owe a debt of sort of coloured food in general, owes a debt to the Arabic nations. We were being exposed to it, as I said, when we were on pilgrimages, but also the Crusades, the Arabic influence in southern Spain. So when people were their soldiers were coming back from the Crusades, they'd probably experienced these wonderful golden hued dishes and highly spiced dishes, and wanted to sort of, to a degree, experience that back at home. Al-Baghdadi's book of dishes, for example, has many recipes that include saffron. So I'm pretty sure that would have inspired the Normans when they sort of came across this cuisine. Now, gold was thought by Arabic physicians to lengthen human life. So if you can see how the leap between eating gold itself and having a golden hued dish coloured with saffron, you would be sort of vicariously consuming the life-enhancing properties of gold. There is a saying that gold in physic is cordial. That's from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's in the prologue. And although physicians knew or believed that gold was really good for you to eat it, to consume it, they were also canny enough to realise that if you eat gold leaf, it comes out the same way it goes in. It doesn't get digested. So there was a real push in sort of the 17th century, particularly 16th and 17th centuries, to find a form of potable gold, something you could drink. There was a goldsmith's son, a story I particularly like, called Francis Anthony, and he claims to have developed a drinkable gold and made an absolute fortune off the back of it, because people thought they were literally drinking liquid gold. And I have come across recipes in manuscripts that have been written by the lady of the house. There's a particular lady called Grace Mildmay who kept records of her. She was very interested in medicine at a time when she wouldn't have been able to practice as a professional doctor. And she kept a list of her recipes, medicinal recipes, one of which is drinkable gold, and that one didn't contain saffron. But of course, if you wanted to persuade people they were drinking something that had the benefits of gold, the easiest way to do it, and the cheaper way, let's be honest, was to colour your cordial, or your aquavitae, this is an example of, with saffron. This one is actually a recipe called usquebaugh or usquebaugh, which has been coloured with saffron. It's got lots of spices and herbs in it, and like licorice. I'm not going to lie, I think it's quite an acquired taste. Another remedy that you often see saffron appearing in is something called surfeit water. Now, we ate our meals in courses during this time, right up really till the 19th century. And you would have, in a course, as you probably know, you would have a number of dishes for each course, usually 3 courses, but a number of dishes. And so it's easy to see how people could possibly overindulge at a meal. And so therefore you were recommended to have a digestive, I guess you would call it, of surfeit water, which contained, as you can see, this is a recipe from Hannah Glass, quite a renowned 18th century writer in Britain. And it contains, as you can see, it's got the saffron here and a myriad of other ingredients, which personally I think if I consumed that would probably give me indigestion. But apparently it was good for dealing with overindulgence. And it should be said, saffron cordials generally were cordials in themselves, not always coloured with saffron, but were very popular during this period, sort of 16th through to the 18th century. And they had a base of aquavitae, which is a distillation. I suppose nowadays you'd call them, we'd probably refer to them as gin, but they were extremely alcoholic. So there was a wonderful story of one of Elizabeth's, the first statesman, Thomas Smith, or 2 of her statesmen, I should say, Thomas Smith and Sir William Cecil, who you may have heard of, sort of exchanging recipes for these remedies for various ailments. I love the idea of these 2 grumpy old men sitting together, chewing the fats and discussing their various ailments and swapping recipes for various surfeit waters and other cordials. But of course, it was used, gold was used still at this time. It wasn't completely sort of eradicated, or its use wasn't eradicated by saffron. It was used particularly for special feasts. So, for example, Richard III, when he was crowned in 1483, they ordered the wardrobe, which was the department responsible for the herbs and the spices, I should say, ordered 100 sheets of gold leaf just for that feast alone. But the neighbouring department, the sorcery, which as the name implies, was responsible for making the sauces for the said feast, ordered 3 pounds of saffron. Now that was just for one meal. That's an awful lot of saffron. But of course, it wasn't an everyday ingredient. We have to remember that it was still, for the most part, used sparingly, and it was only available to really wealthy households. So this is a list of purchases of spices and almonds and rice from Alice de Brienne. She was a Suffolk noblewoman, right? And this is from the early 15th century. And you can see her household, they would have been buying these probably at special fairs once or twice a year, tops. This is her annual account for, she's buying pepper, ginger, cinnamon and cloves. And hopefully you can see the prices. But saffron was selling, she was paying 13 shillings for a pound of saffron. And when you compare that to, even the almonds, she was only paying for 20 pounds of almonds, just over 4 shillings. So it was incredibly expensive, hence, for the most part, used very sparingly. So how was it used? What recipes was it used in? Well, obviously, we've discussed sort of the benefits of having this wonderful yellow coloured food in the sort of dark periods of year like Lent and Advent when you were fasting. But it was also used to enhance colour green, for example. So you can see here a peat art. This was used to sort of really enhance the green colour. And it really does work. I've got these recipes in my book. Sort of really make the green pop is the only way I can really describe it. And the other picture is of, sorry, it's a little bit blurred, but it's blown up like this, but it's of a green sauce, a verde sauce, which is, I always describe to people as like salsa verde, but entirely vegetarian. There's no anchovies in it, but it's beautiful sauce. It's such a versatile sauce. I love it. And it's got, that also has saffron in it. And this was known, this sort of colour enhancement, if you know, it was known as, could create something called gaudy green in English, or vergay, which I think sounds much nicer. And it was also occasionally saffron sprinkled over dishes. We know this from the Ménagère de Paris, which is a French medieval cookery manual, that it was sprinkled over some dishes. I would think this is an incredibly extravagant use of it. It's described as in French as being frangé, which doesn't have a literal English translation, but if you think of it as a bit like we sprinkle sugar on things today. The other thing that is probably more common in terms of our mind of using saffron was to gild things, particularly birds, for example. So this is my impression of a gilded chicken. You know, a little saffron goes a long way, especially when it's diluted in a liquid, and it's far more economical to use this than gold leaf. So quite often they might have, if when they put the feathers back on, they might gild a bird's beak, for example. But if they wanted to give the effect of a naked bird, if you like, being gilded, they were far more likely to use saffron. And you often see recipes finishing with the instruction in the medieval era, endour with yolks of eruin and saffron. Now, the cockatrice, which was a mythical creation presented at feasts, which featured the back end of a cockerel and the front end of a pig sort of spliced together, that was also basted in a batter of flour, egg yolks, ground ginger and saffron. So it could be served as a royal meat, which is, that's to say, something suitable for the noble table. The best medieval cooks were artists, really, in their own right. You know, they could transform something relatively mundane, such as a roast chicken that we have here, into something astounding. And this lovely Madeleine Pelner-Cosman refers to this as aurifiction rather than aurifaction, which I love that phrase. A good example, I think, is the golden apples, which were served at the feast of Henry IV in 1399 coronation feast. And this is my own impression of a golden apple. I am going to put my hands up here and say I did embellish it further with one of those gold sprays that you can buy. So I did cheat a little bit, but for the sake of the camera. But I dipped them, if you like, their meatballs in the batter and baked them after they'd been boiled. And you do get this beautiful sort of colour you can see at the bottom. So I'm pointing here. The batter was sort of this sort of colour. It looks stunning. But of course, the one thing I haven't touched on is flavour. You know, it's all well and good making food look pretty, but, you know, flavour must have been important as well, because saffron does appear in a number of recipes that have got ingredients in it that so you wouldn't know the saffron's in there. They sort of mute the yellow or obliterate it entirely. One thing, particularly beef stews, there's another recipe called richoux, which are a pastry which is encloses a dried fruit filling with dried figs, raisins, and a number of spices, one of which is saffron. So you can't even see the saffron inside the pastry. So it must have been included for a flavour reasons. And one of the other recipes it occurs in is one of the earliest recipes we have for gingerbread, for example, and that includes cinnamon, pepper, and saffron, but curiously no ginger. And it's interesting because it does add a completely different dimension to something that's quite familiar, we would otherwise be quite familiar with. Now, one of the questions I get asked a lot is how much saffron is too much saffron, and what is a pinch? Now, I always say, well, my pinch is not the same as your pinch. So I think, those beautiful strands I showed you at the beginning, if you count them out, I would say my pinch is about 18 to 20 strands. Now, that sounds like a lot. And I do say to people, if you're a bit worried about it tasting bitter or soapy, use less. I think, as with all spices, you have to use a bit of your own sort of judgment on how much to use. So saffron was used in the medieval era through the 16th and into the 17th centuries fairly extensively, but by the 18th century, it was beginning to decline quite rapidly in this country. It was still being produced in Cambridgeshire, for example, but by the 19th century, homegrown saffron had all but disappeared. We know, for example, that the last saffron grower, documented saffron grower that we know about, died in 1827 at the age of 89. So after that, it's rare to see English saffron being sort of marketed on a wide scale. Even as early as 1678, there were indications that it was under fierce competition from saffron being imported from other places like Spain. So Gideon Harvey reported that English saffron was selling at 50 shillings a pound in 1678, but in Spain, Spanish saffron was only selling at 24 shillings a pound. So you could see how people would perhaps be more inclined to buy the Spanish saffron than the English saffron. Where it did continue, however, was in savoury goods. I mean, it does still appear in what we would consider in Britain as foreign cuisines, particularly in the 19th century, when we established sort of our colonial interests in India. It does appear in curries, for example, quite frequently. But in the domestic sphere, it's pretty much disappears entirely by the 19th century from what I would class as classic English dishes. Now, where it does continue is in baked goods. So here we have a simnel cake, one of the examples of where saffron was used historically. Now, this is this is a hybrid, I would say, of a modern day mixed with an old style simnel cake or fruit cake. Now, cakes in the past used to be leavened with yeast, and the base of this cake is a yeasted, is based on a recipe from Jervis Markham from 1615. It's a spice cake recipe. It does contain saffron and fruit, and it's like I guess like a brioche, you would say, sort of a brioche style cake. Saffron was used also in breads for feasts, as I've discussed, and simnels are no exception, because they were made classically for the Mothering Sunday, but although they were also made, a lot of people realise, at Christmas and for Easter themselves. In this country, we still tend to serve simnel cakes at Easter rather than around Mothering Sunday. But originally, in the original simnel, the cake itself inside probably didn't include saffron. Where the saffron was contained is they used to coat them in a pastry that was coloured with saffron. So they'd be beautiful golden colour. And then the cake was inside. It was boiled and then baked. So what resulted was that you had an extremely tough outer layer encasing this cake. And I assume that was to keep the cake, it's inside itself, as fresh for as long as possible. Now, simnels were still being made in this fashion well into the 19th century. And there was one account I read of a lady confusing her rather large simnel for a footstool. It was that hard. So I guess she must have needed a pretty sturdy knife to cut into it. But of course, nowadays, I don't know whether you have this in the States, but nowadays in England, a simnel cake has entirely lost the outer coating of pastry, and it has been replaced with normally a layer of marzipan through the middle of the cake, and then topped with more marzipan and 11 balls of marzipan, which are said to represent Christ's disciples, obviously minus Judas. Now, saffron buns were particularly popular, or saffron cakes as they're usually referred to in old cookbooks. This recipe you can see here is from the 18th century in Sarah Harrison's Housekeeper's Pocket Book. often nowadays in Cornwall, particularly in Devon, you would expect to find a saffron bun containing dried fruit. And there are recipes from this period of the 18th century that say you can include dried fruit, but it was far more common actually for seeds to be included. So, for example, Hannah Glass, who we met earlier, she has a saffron cake recipe in her book, the Art of Cookery Made Plain and Simple, and that contains caraway seeds, which she does when she gets to the end of the recipe. She does say she doesn't actually like caraway seeds. But you can put them in if you feel like it. This recipe has coriander seeds, conversely, and it's actually, I think, they really sort of marry up well, the saffron and the coriander. I think this is possibly my favourite type of saffron cake, with the coriander seeds. In Cornwall, which for some reason is the only, although at one point these would have been freely available all around the country. I don't know where Sarah Harrison herself was from, but certainly it was possible to get saffron cakes or buns all over the country at this point. But for some reason, they've sort of resolutely maintained that tradition in Cornwall, and we've lost it in other counties in this country. In Cornwall itself, they apparently used to mark the saffron buns when it was Easter with a cross, like hot cross buns that we would get, say, in Sussex. And the idea was that would ward off evil spirits. But the Cornish also believed that if you kept one of these Good Friday buns all year round, at which point it would be incredibly stale, obviously, it wouldn't go mouldy though, and you could grate it into the broth of an invalid and it would help make them better. And they also, in Cornwall, they used to include saffron in their Christmas cakes, although crucially you weren't allowed to cut the cake until Christmas Day itself because it was bad luck. And one of the most poignant things I discovered when I was doing my research, I went down to Cornwall to the Cres-and-Kernel archives, and I found a lot of letters that had been sent back from the home front, or the Western Front rather, by soldiers from Cornwall that had received food parcels from Newquay Borough Council. And in those parcels, they were sent around Christmas time. As you can see, this letter was dated the 26th of the 12th, 1917. They wrote back that they included some good old-fashioned saffron cake. And the soldiers that wrote back was just so delighted to receive this wonderful taste of home. And the idea was that they were going to receive something that like their mother would make. What's particularly funny is when you read some of the letters, they explain that they were sharing them with their comrades in the trenches, and that some of the other fellow soldiers were quite dismissive or quite wary about eating these bright yellow buns that had been sent across the ocean. But actually, when they tried them, they thought they were absolutely delicious. So I thought that was just such a lovely sort of poignant thing to discover. It's probably not relevant to you guys unless you happen to be coming over to the UK, but where the saffron, they're trying to revive sort of, not perhaps a saffron market per se, because there'll only be a small amount of saffron being sold here in Saffron Walden on Saffron Day, but they are having a Saffron Day in Saffron Walden, the historic home of saffron production in the UK, on the 16th of October, which I'm part of. And that's it. So as I've said, this is a lot of the things I've showed you today in terms of the recipes are in my book, Fool's Gold, A History of British Saffron, which is, I believe, if it's not out yet, it's out shortly in the US. And you can, if you've got any questions that spring to mind after today's session, you'll feel free to email me, or you can visit my website, and there's other social media things there if you would like to have a look. I'm going to stop sharing now. Oh, no.
Okay.
There you go.
By the way, so Cynthia Clampett was in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. This is in the Upper Peninsula area.
Oh, yes.
And found that due to the large population of Cornish miners, in addition to pasties, They have saffron buns and cookbooks
lovely.
for tourists on how to make them.
Oh, good. That's good to hear. There was it doesn't relate to Mineral Point directly, but there was a writer called Vida Hurd, and she was South African, and a lot of people left Cornwall in the 19th century, and they emigrated to the US, Canada, and South Africa. And apparently their families used to send them parcels of saffron to in South Africa, and they got basically confiscated by the customs because they thought it was something incredibly dodgy that they were being sent over. So it's good to hear that it was saffron buns were being made in Mineral Point. It's great to know that it's spread this far. So
right, and they did the pasties, but when the Cornish miners left the area, they were replaced by Finnish miners, who also had a tradition of making pasties. But in their home country in Finland, they made it with rye dough.
Yeah.
But they continued to make it with wheat flour dough, like the local Cornish people had done.
Yeah.
So there you go.
They're quite interesting. Their pasties. Oh, I say pasties. I can't remember what they're called exactly. My friend, I have a very good Finnish friend, and whenever I visit her, she makes sure I try lots of traditional Finnish foods. So it's
well, at least in the United States, we refer to it. I mean, in this region where we're aware of it, it's pasties.
Yeah. I mean, it's good that there's that cultural exchange or culinary exchange. So it tickled me that they had this problem getting the saffron into South Africa initially. I believe they did eventually get through, but
send cheese to the United States, it will be confiscated by customs. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going. I don't know what I was going to say. Actually, I was going to say I think it's being grown in the States, saffron. I was trying to find before I started the call. I know someone started following me on Instagram last year, and I think they might be in Vermont. Someone on the call might know, but I believe you have saffron being grown here, grown there. I mean, we have a number of producers now in Britain, sort of being revived, again on a small scale, because it is still such a labour-intensive industry. It's really, I can't sort of stress enough, there really are no shortcuts, apart from maybe the planting these days. It's all done by hand, and they struggle every year with the harvest because people go, we'll come and help pick your saffron and pick this. They've got so many stories of people turning up for one day's work and then never coming back again. So it's so hard.
Well, they got one day's work out of them.
Well, yeah.
I have a question. It has to do with, you referred to the apicius, at least that's what we call it here, but you have another pronunciation. I'd love to hear it.
Apicius.
Okay.
So do you know Sally Granger?
No, but tell us all about.
So Sally Granger, bear with, I've got one of her books here. So I've got a bookshelf next to me, if I can find it. Right, so hopefully you can see that. It's back to front for me, but Sally Granger has written, and with her husband Christopher Grocock, have written extensively about, they've studied Apicius. This is actually, if you can get hold of this in the US, it's published by Prospect Books, who published my books, but it's great if you want to get into Roman cookery, because they've converted them for modern kitchens. She's told me it's Apicius, but she does say, a lot of people still say Apicius, but she pronounces it Apicius. I used to say Apicius, but it's Apicius.
Okay, good. Then we're on the same, because well, Cynthia Clampett, she's here. She informed us that was the correct way to pronounce it.
Apicius or Apicius?
No,
Apicius.
What you did. Yeah, in fact, Cynthia, why don't you let me get her here, because this was a discussion point a while back, and maybe she'll tell us we're doing it wrong. All right, Cynthia, if you want to join us, you're welcome to.
Here we go. Okay. Well, it was just basically having studied some Latin. I know that Latin, if you're speaking Latin, C is pronounced K.
Okay.
But in America, it's like Cicero. If you've heard of Cicero, the
Yep.
great Roman philosopher, it would have been Cicero.
Cicero. Oh, how weird! I hadn't
So
thought
it's
of that.
one of those things where it's like, well, I mean, it's everything. It's like when I was in Turkey, I went to Cappadocia, which of course we call Cappadocia here. So it's one of those things where, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to communicate with people, then you pronounce it the way they're going to understand it.
Of course, yeah.
But yes, I've gone back and forth between Apicius and Apicius just because, okay, this is America and we don't speak Latin.
Yeah.
I thought it was Greek, Cynthia.
No, Apicius is
okay.
Latin.
All right, fine.
Yeah.
Because he was Roman. Romans, that was
Yeah.
I mean, it may have been adopted from the Greek because I know a lot of Roman stuff was, but I just know it was from studying Latin that I got the K sound.
Yeah.
My dad used to always correct me that it was Cicero, not Cicero.
I didn't know. I didn't even think of that, but yeah, you're right. I mean, my son actually told me he used to do Latin, and he said it was Apicius as well. But I met Sally for the first time in person this year, and I did ask her. She goes, I say Apicius. She goes, but I'm aware a lot of people say Apicius. She goes, people will still know who you're talking about, so that's the important thing. So, or
they will have no idea what you're talking about, and they'll just believe you because you told them.
Well, yeah, there's that as well. Yeah. Has anyone got any other questions they'd like to ask?
Yes, I do. Again, nothing to do with your talk precisely, but you mentioned lampreys.
Oh, yes.
And in the Great Lakes, we have an invasive lamprey population.
Okay.
So where in the UK, if you wanted lampreys, would you obtain them?
Oh, gosh, now you're asking.
Every river in England.
I don't think they are. I think they're quite rare now. I think we.
Well, I know, but I'm just saying in the old days.
Oh, in the old days, yeah, they were quite common, but I don't think they were farmed. I mean, we did have fish farms of the sort, particularly in monasteries and stuff, because obviously they vast amounts of the year they didn't eat meat. But lampreys, I think, were indigenous. I don't think they are anymore. I'm not an expert on fish. I think if you want to get hold of lampreys, from other food historians I know that have cooked lamprey, I think they've had to get them in, go to a specialist supplier, and I think they're imported from Eastern Europe now. But
there's a place in Greenwich where you can get jellied eel.
Yeah.
That's very nice. But the reason I ask is because there's a restaurant that specializes in English meat pies here in the in Chicago area. And they were given a small quantity of lampreys harvested from the Great Lakes to make a kind of a coronation type pie or whatever the
yes
was. And I was allowed just to taste a little bit of the syrup of the gravy or whatever you want to say it, because everything was intended for some other event. But they were claiming that when the UK needs lampreys, like for the royal household, they're getting them from the Great Lakes. It was just one of those things. When you mentioned lampreys, it was like, all right, you're the person to ask.
I'm pretty sure they're not getting them from an English source, so they could get many. So traditionally, I think it's Gloucestershire. That's where they were particularly predominant, and they used to. It was a tradition at one point to give the king or queen that was being crowned a lamprey pie when they were. They did. I don't know whether she got one for this Jubilee that we had, Elizabeth II earlier this year, her 70th year. But they used to, somewhere in this country, they used to produce these lamprey pies. I'm sure someone will try and do one for King Charles when he gets crowned next year. But I've never tried them. I can't say I mean, I'll give anything a go once. I guess there's probably a bit like they look a bit like an eel. I assume they taste a bit like an eel, or you probably have a better idea, Kathy, if you've tried a bit of pie yourself. But
Just the barest amount of the juice that leaked out.
They're not very pretty fish. I know that much. I have seen pictures of them. They're pretty nasty looking fish.
And they're nasty to come upon. I mean, they're sucking off a fish, and it can be a bunch of them. You know,
yeah,
basically killing their host.
But yeah, poor old Henry I, he ate too many of them, and apparently his physicians used to warn him about his overindulgence. I doubt very much it was I guess he could have got food poisoning, but I doubt it was actually the fish itself that killed him. But that's the legend. That you don't eat too many lampreys, otherwise you'll die. You didn't obviously have enough saffron with them, I guess. But yeah.
Well, unless I don't think anybody's coming up with a question, because I think you told us so much that we're still ingesting. That. Sorry,
I did say I did. No. I know I said to you last night. I was trying not to go. It's tough with you're not quite sure the crowd you're talking to. So when I do usually do quite a big section on the whole explaining the humours, because to lay people, because they don't really understand, or the chances are they're not going to understand. But yeah. And there
was an era when everybody knew what the humours were, and now now it's a faded topic.
It is.
Well, it went out when they stopped bleeding people.
Sorry?
I said the interest in humors went out when we stopped bleeding people.
Oh, really?
That's why you bled people, is to balance the humors.
Well, yeah. I mean, that was one way of doing it. But you could write a whole book on related to humoral theory and the use of things like saffron and other herbs and spices. It's a fascinating area, but I had to be quite brief in the book. I only had a small word count, relatively speaking. So I touch on the medicinal uses of saffron, but only very briefly. I mean, it did get cropped up in a lot of things, even things like laudanum. But I think a lot of the times it was probably added to make things look more colourful and perhaps a bit more appealing. As well as the supposed benefits. But,
well, I'm going to send you a copy of the chat, because there were people just thrilled with your talk today.
Thank you.
And I'm going to let you return to your life, which apparently is you still got some daylight left.
It's just coming up for 5:30 over here. So I can hear noises in the house. Either my cats have broken into the kitchen and are eating the gingerbread I made, or my husband and son have returned from, he had a soccer match earlier. So, So,
well, I'll return you to your life, but thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.